It's my pleasure this evening to introduce an esteemed compatriot of mine from my graduate school days. Tonight's guest, Dr. Antoine Pageau-St-Hilaire, is currently a postdoctoral research fellow affiliated with the University of Ottawa. Previously, he was a fellow at Boston University and Oxford, and he obtained his PhD in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. His work centers on ancient philosophy, especially that of Plato and Aristotle, along with its reception in the post-Kantian European tradition. He has published books on Heidegger and German Platonism, along with essays on ancient philosophy, phenomenology, and hermeneutics, and he's currently working on a book on the subject of play and education in Plato. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pageau-St-Hilaire for his lecture titled Considerations on Play, Paidia, and Liberal Education in Plato's Republic.
First things first, thank you so much. Thank you, Aparna, for the nice introduction. I want to thank Dean Davis, Paul Cooley, Tutor Guillermo Bleichmar, and their colleagues for their very generous invitation. I'm very grateful, and to you all, of course, for being here tonight. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity not only to share some of my thoughts on Plato education and play tonight with you, but also to meet this community that I have heard so much about, and a community that has formed people that I have met along my own ways that I've always found extraordinarily interesting, fascinating, and very nice people. So it's great for me to meet you, and I look forward to our conversation after this. And I'm glad to have this opportunity exactly to share with you some of my thoughts on this topic, which is dear to my heart and I believe quite congenial to the educative mission of St. John's College. So for the context, some years ago when I was in grad school alongside Aparna in the Committee on Social Thought at U Chicago, I reread the beginning of Plato's Laws in a class on ancient aesthetics. One of the things that caught our attention in the seminar was that the treatment of imitation, mimesis, seemed quite different in the Republic and in the Laws. Prima facie, it looks indeed like the founders of Callipolis are much more cautious about the potential dangers of imitation, and they therefore supervene the use of imitation with a myriad of rules so as to protect the city from these dangers. The purification of mimetic poetry is much more intense in the Republic than in the Laws. And there are many ways to account for this difference, and I intend to spare you all of these scholarly disputes. Glad to be here and to be able to spare you these disputes. At any rate, the angle I found back then to illuminate what's going on in the Laws was the notion of play. The Laws explore in far greater details than elsewhere in the Platonic corpus the idea of play, paidia, and it reflects quite subtly on how play affects the soul of people who are immersed in it. We may want to say that it provides in minutiae a moral psychology of play, and it tries to make the most of the resources of play for moral education. I thus gave a first stab at this question of play and moral education in the Laws, and then came back to my dissertation work, which was on a different topic. But this question remained with me, and it has remained with me for about 7 years now, so I decided to come back to it more thoroughly, and I'm now revisiting it by embarking on this book project on play and education in Plato. This is the beginning of that project, so although in some sense I'm coming back to an old question, the considerations I'm offering you tonight are very inceptive and tentative, kind of provisional remarks. Of course, with Plato, we're always beginners. I think you've probably felt that here. But I want to emphasize that I'm really no exception at all. In a nutshell, here is my working hypothesis for tonight. Play in the Laws is very much exploited for the purposes of a moral and political education to virtue. Its function is chiefly civic education. What we find in the Republic, at least in book 7 of the Republic, is different. Socrates is exploring the relation between play and liberal education. Of course, it's tricky to distinguish between civic education and liberal education. And by no means do I intend to put these two in opposition. Education in the Republic is most evidently tied to the goodness of the beautiful city, so in this sense it obviously is civic too. And to be sure, education in the Republic is always tied to virtue and to the tremendously difficult task of becoming good, virtuous human beings. What I intend with this contrast is rather that the perspective from which is envisioned at least one kind of education, the education of future guardians who will become philosopher queens and kings, that perspective is not confined by the limits of the city. And the sense in which this education is liberal, I think, is closely tied to the fact that its purposefulness is not exhausted by how it will enable those who are thusly educated to serve the city, although clearly it will enable them to serve it. I'll say more about that later. What I hope to show is that Socrates sees, or at least helps us see, a deep affinity between the freedom characteristic of such education and the structure of play. And this is why, in an important passage of Book 7, he tells Glaucon that the future guardians should be educated through play. But before we get to Republic 7, I want us to look at some passages from the Laws and the Republic on play in order to provide some methodological remarks about play in these two different dialogues and about play and seriousness more generally. After I've done that, we will be able to turn to the curriculum of liberal education in Book 7 and to address the question of why it would be suited that such an education be playful. You have a handout on which there are several quotes, right? And they should be divided according to the tripartite structure of the paper. Every good Plato paper needs to be structured in a tripartite way, of course. So the first section, play from the Laws to the Republic. The Laws is quite singular in that it envisions a city that will constantly be playing fine games. It is a playing city, and indeed very much a singing and dancing city. It's an awesome city. The Athenian Strangers asserts in the Laws, that's in Book 7, T1 on the handout, every man and woman should spend life in this way, playing the finest possible games. And if we ask, why is that? Well, T2 tells us, the character of the games played is decisive for the establishment of the laws, since it determines whether or not the established laws will persist. What the Athenian Stranger says about the city, the constitution in the laws, Socrates says it about the individual person in the Republic. That's T3. Socrates says, unless someone has a transcendent nature, they would never become good if from earliest childhood their play isn't fine and all their practices aren't such. This passage emphasizes the importance of child play, to be sure, and it could lead us to think that the Republic confines play, paidia, to childhood, paidia, whereas it is extended to the whole of civic life in the laws. But I doubt this is the case, for as we shall see, and as I shall discuss later, potential guardians will be introduced playfully to the various disciplines of liberal education's curriculum. And it seems like this will go on at least until they're about 20 years old. But I think it's not quite clear whether it will stop to be playful after 20 years old. It's bizarre what's happening between 20 and 30. We can talk about this later. The main difference between the Republic and the laws instead seems to be the following. In the Republic, there is the lawful play of children's musical education in the early parts of the book, and then the play of liberal education. And while the former aims at the moral education of children, the second is geared toward their intellectual formation. In the laws, most of the playful, if not all of the playful education, or of education as play, takes the form of a musical education which is geared toward the moral formation of children and adults alike, including elder people. In both cases, however, if we are to grant a pedagogical function to play, we face a methodological problem. The problem is that quite often in Plato's dialogues, we face a semantic opposition between play, paidia, and seriousness, spude. In fact, most, if not all, occurrences of spudaios and its cognates in the corpus mean something like goodness or virtue. And paidia and its cognates are often used to deride either an activity or a type of person as falling short of such serious goodness. This is the case when, for instance, philosophy is derided by its opponents as mere play, like in the Symposium and the Gorgias. But it's even more striking when tyranny and sophistry are depicted as play, as it happens in the Republic, the Sophist, and the Euthydemus. We also encounter in the Statesman and in the Laws accounts of play that look almost like definitions and which turn on the exclusion of seriousness. If this opposition between play and seriousness holds across the board, then we would seem to have to say that playful education is unserious. And not only this, at several places in Plato's dialogues, in the Phaedrus, the Parmenides, the Timaeus, the Republic, and the Laws, the ongoing philosophical inquiry itself is referred to as, by the leading interlocutors as play. But is philosophy not serious and good? The best way to get out of these paradoxes, in my view, is to give a teleological account of the relationship between play and seriousness. Providing such an account is a task that I want to do this at the beginning of my book, but of course I'm not starting my book at the beginning of my book. For today, let me just propose that account to you very succinctly. So if play is directed toward a serious purpose, it is serious or good play. If it is not, it is unserious or bad play. I take it that this view is explicit in one of the Athenian stranger's interventions in Book 7 of the Laws, one that I already partly quoted, but that I'm going to quote in a fuller way on T4. The Athenian says, "Every man and woman should spend life in this way, playing the finest possible games and thinking about them in a way that is opposite of the way they're now thought about." How's that? Nowadays, presumably, they suppose the serious things should be for the sake of the playful things. So the Athenian is saying that we should play for the sake of the serious, rather. Now, you may immediately object that when we are at play and immersed in whatever game we're playing, we do not play for the sake of some kind of extrinsic serious business. I agree, and think this is a crucial feature of play. And we will have to come back to this crucial feature. However, we can nonetheless assess the purposeful orientation of play from a different perspective than that of the internal or subjective viewpoint of the person who is immersed in play. So I don't think the stranger is saying that the citizens of Magnesia should think about the serious purposes of their games while playing their games. Thus, a player can play without any further serious intent, but her play can nonetheless be directed by someone else's work towards some good or serious purpose. And that must be the case in the use of play in education in the Platonic dialogues. So to put it briefly, we can distinguish between the internal teleology of play, where play is its own end, and the external teleology of play, where play can be oriented toward serious goodness or not. I'm coming to the second section. Now let us turn to the curriculum described in Book 7 of the Republic after the allegory of the cave. The discussion begins with what Socrates tells Glaucon we should conclude from that image, the allegory, if that image is true. Education is not what some people claim it is. It's not putting knowledge in the soul like putting sight into blind eyes. Rather, it is a conversion, a turning around of the soul as a whole, a psyches periagoge. The direction of this turning around matters. The soul must be turned from darkness to light, that is, from becoming to being, and to the most brilliant part of being, namely the good. In devising the curriculum, this is the leitmotif of Socrates throughout. What is taught and the way it is taught must be such as to turn the soul toward being. Thus, the initial task is to examine which among these learning subjects has such capacity. And then for each discipline or science, Socrates will specify in what way it should and should not be studied. As most of you are surely quite familiar with this story, let me briefly summarize this higher education curriculum and then look a bit closer at how Socrates and Glaucon treat the specific sciences it encompasses. After receiving a moral education in the form of music, young guardians will endure physical training, the kind that not only improves the body, but most importantly shapes the soul. While still children, yet not at the same time of their physical training, they will be introduced to a series of 5 mathematical sciences: arithmetic, which comprises number and calculation, geometry, stereometry, astronomy, and harmonics. Their study of these sciences is divided in 2 phases: an introductory phase until 20 years old, and a more systematic study between age 20 and 30. Socrates is vague about how long will this first phase last and how exactly these 2 phases of mathematical training differ and relate to one another. After studying these sciences, they will do dialectic for 5 years, and then some kind of internship in political rulership, going back to the cave and learning for 15 years how to govern human affairs in light of what they have seen. Only then will they be apt to serve as philosopher queens and kings. Let's first look at how arithmetic is introduced in that curriculum. In looking for a mathema that helps turning the souls from becoming toward being, Socrates reminds Glaucon that future philosopher rulers are also warriors. So the science they're looking for must have that protreptic function of turning the soul around and also be useful to warriors. It cannot be gymnastics, for it applies to a body that is subject to becoming. It cannot be music, for music is more a matter of harmonious habits rather than science. It cannot be any of the crafts of the techni, for these are mechanical or unworthy or vulgar, banauzoi. Through this elimination process, Socrates proposes instead to look not for a particular mathema, but rather for a more general or common one, to koinon, that applies to everything, epipanta, namely to all crafts and all sciences. This turns out to be the science of number, of calculation, arithmon te kailogismon. Arithmetic, thusly construed, is necessarily for the man of war, for the polemikos aner, who supervenes the order of an army, but Socrates adds, most of all, if that man is going to be a human being, malon de kai anthropos esestai. This twofold orientation of arithmetic provides the teleological structure that guides much of the discussion of the mathematical curriculum. 3 pages later, Socrates says that the study of number and calculation should serve 2 ends and not 3. The end he rejects is the most common application of this knowledge in ordinary life, the business of buying and selling. This application is deemed as vulgar. The words he labels it with, kapelos and kapeleuein, means not only retail selling, but also denotes the idea of a petty trade, illegal peddling, or even cheating and corruption. Socrates then grants 2 proper ends to arithmetics. It is, quote, for the sake of war and for the sake of facilitation of the turning the soul itself from becoming toward truth and being. It's worth pausing a moment to see just what Socrates is doing here. The 3 ends he considers map pretty well onto the 3 classes of Polis. The end of arithmetic he rejects, the most pedestrian one, seems to be the fashion in which the productive class of craftspeople would need to use it. Then there is the military end, which is the way that auxiliaries would deal with number and calculation. Finally, there is the paraclectic function of arithmetic, the one that serves no other purpose than the good of the soul. Socrates cannot deny the military function of arithmetic in the curriculum because philosopher rulers will be selected from a class of warriors, and presumably because philosopher rulers will need knowledge of warfare in order to rule well. So he must grant it. But we readers are rightly perplexed by at least two things. First, how is a vision of the nature of numbers, theanteston arithmon physeos, necessary for military purposes? Second, when Socrates rephrases his initial tripartite teleological distinction, he seems to reduce it to a bipartite distinction. Calculation, he says, is refined and useful in many ways when someone practices it for the sake of knowing and not for the sake of peddling. But does learning math for the sake of war, is learning math for the sake of war the same as learning math for the sake of knowing? It doesn't seem so. I think these are ways in which Socrates indicates that the most authentic end of arithmetic studies is knowing, coming in contact with truth and being. This becomes a bit more transparent when our interlocutors approach the topic of geometry. Glaucon seems quite proud to have guessed correctly that the next discipline after arithmetic is geometry. And he goes on to list all the kinds of usefulness of geometrical knowledge for a military for a military general. But Socrates interjects and softens his enthusiasm, remarking that the extent to which a general must be a geometer is quite limited. For those purposes, only a little portion of geometry and calculation is needed. He goes on to ridicule those who are mere practitioners, pratontes, and who cultivate geometry for the sake of action, Pageau-St-Hilaire. For in truth, he says, the whole of this learning subject, pan to mathema, is pursued for the sake of knowledge, gnoseos-Hilaire. And he makes a precision. Not only is the whole of this science for the sake of knowing, but for the sake of knowing what is always, and not what at some time comes to be and perishes. Socrates concludes by timidly granting the military ends of geometrical studies, but only as byproducts or incidental advantages, ta parerga. As though he did not really understand why he was just chastised by Socrates, once astronomy is mentioned as the next mathema of the curriculum, Glaucon says that astronomical knowledge is no less useful for military expertise than for agriculture and sailing or navigation by sea. He's showing that he did not quite grasp the general lesson and the more specific lesson Socrates has just been teaching. His general mistake is to set his eyes on the extrinsic benefits of a mathematical science, whereas he should be thinking about its intrinsic benefits. His particular mistake is to think about too low of an extrinsic benefit of astronomy. For whereas navigation may be part of strategia, of generalship or military expertise, and so in some sense the concern of warriors and military leaders, agriculture or farming is not. It's the business of the working or productive class of Callipolis. The education of the guardians cannot be bothered by such undignified concerns. Thus, Socrates chastises him once more. That's T5. I am amused, he said. He says that you're afraid of the many, lest they think you prescribe useless studies. It's not at all easy, but indeed quite difficult to be of the conviction that in these studies is purified and rekindled an organ of every soul that is spoiled and blinded by other preoccupations. An organ whose preservation is infinitely better than that of the eyes. For indeed, only with it is the truth seen. As though things were not already bad enough, Socrates pauses the discussion of astronomy because he realized they've skipped an important science that logically comes after geometry. After studying two-dimensional figures, students should study solids. And only thereafter should they be prepared to study solids in motion, namely astronomy. Socrates and Glaucon had forgotten about stereometry. Never forget about stereometry. Why? That's not quite clear, though. Socrates' enthusiasm for this underdeveloped, perhaps even not quite existing science should strike us as odd. What the progression from arithmetic to geometry and then to stereometry points to, I think, is the idea that the curriculum progresses from simpler to more complex objects by adding depth or dimensions. What is singular about stereometry is that it studies the most complex among unmoved mathematical objects. For astronomy and harmonics, consider things in motion, and in particular motions accessible respectively through the senses of sight and hearing. Socrates warns us against a risk that this sensuous axis in astronomy and harmonics involves when he corrects the poor Glaucon one more time. For Glaucon wants to give an improved praise of astronomy once they go back to astronomy, unconcerned with productive and practical endeavors such as farming, sailing, and generalship. He seems proud to say that he will now praise it in the manner of Socrates. And he affirms on T6, "It seems indeed to me that it's evident to all that it compels the soul to look above and leads it from the things here to the things there." But doing so, our poor Glaucon is confusing the eyes of the body and the eyes of the soul. Socrates does not hesitate to say in reply to Glaucon that by emphasizing that our bodily eyes look up, astronomy is actually forcing the soul to look down, forcing it to look down. Instead, the proper way to study astronomy is to consider the heavenly ornaments, the poikilmata, that are embroiled in the visible, and orato pepoikiltai, as examples or paradigms to help us to get at what is invisible, namely the true motions according to their true numbers, their true figures, and so forth. The worry here is not so much that people would study astronomy for merely practical purposes, but that they would get caught up in the actually perceptible motions of the heavenly bodies and think that this is the locus of their true beauty. But genuine beauty, of course, is perceptible by thought alone, not by the senses. It is true that these two worries differ. The worry about the practical concerns of astronomy and the worry about thinking that the beauty of astronomy lies in those beautiful motions of the heavenly bodies. They differ, these worries, but they share something in common. In both cases, Socrates warns us against the temptation to place the value of knowledge outside of knowledge itself. The authentic purpose of astronomy is neither to navigate the sea nor to get a better appreciation of heavenly beauties, but to know the truth for the sake of knowing the truth. If there is any further purpose to astronomy, just like arithmetic, geometry, and stereometry, it is to exercise our intellect and prepare it for dialectic. But that's not an extrinsic purpose, for dialectic too is about doing what's best for our soul. Just as with astronomy, Socrates' treatment of harmonics places nous, the intellect, before the ear. Genuine harmonics will study harmonic numbers and the difference between harmonic and non-harmonic numbers. So much for music. Socrates' almost comic insistence on the primacy of the intelligible over the sensible in discussing these two mathematical sciences again emphasizes that we should not look for extrinsic benefits to knowledge. In the passage I want us to look at and unpack in the next section of my consideration, Socrates refers to this mathematical curriculum as an education that befits free human beings. Recall that he also introduces arithmetic as a course of study most useful if one is to become a human being. This is why I have entitled this section of my remarks, Liberal Education in Republic 7. So before looking at how play will relate to all of this, I want to ask the more basic question, why should we think of this education as liberal education? I think there are two closely connected answers to this question. We may start by defining liberal education, I'm sure you've heard that at least 1,000 times, as an education in freedom and for freedom. Don't laugh at me. Admittedly, this is quite a formal definition, but if we grant it, then I think we can begin to see its content and make it a less formal. So the next premise that I think is essential is that genuine freedom is not the sheer capacity to do whatever we want. As you know, most ancient thinkers, and surely Plato's Socrates, would call this sheer capacity license, exousia. The difference between eleutheria and exousia is that freedom is not freedom from limits, but freedom for the good. The implication is that an education for freedom would be an education toward a certain grasp of the good, a grasp that would in turn illuminate our free choices and the conduct of a free life. Because the whole mathematical curriculum is conceived as a sine qua non preparation for dialectic, and because dialectic itself is supposed to culminate in a grasp of the good itself, the idea of the good beyond being, this curriculum is oriented toward the decisive feature that characterizes true freedom as opposed to license. That's the first sense, I think, in which it can be called liberal education. The second sense has to do with the fact that this education happens in freedom, or another way to put it, that it is liberating. The image of education as a liberation from the prison life of cave dwellers makes it quite clear that Plato invites us to think of genuine education as a liberation. How is this turning around of the soul a liberation? To be sure, it's a liberation from ignorance, a liberation from unexamined opinions that too often keep our minds shackled. A huge part of the Platonic tradition would also emphasize that it's a liberation from our ties to the sensible and material world, from our body and the bodily beings that we cling to. You can be assured that I'm not in the business of denying any of this. But what I've been trying to show in commenting on Socrates' treatment of the mathematical disciplines is that what's usually explained in terms of a liberation from the sensible world toward the intelligible actually shows us that most of the time we humans envision knowledge as primarily oriented towards some extrinsic purpose. We study X for the sake of Y instead of studying X for the sake of understanding X. There are several dangers to this. First, when we do so, the study in question is not undertaken freely, but rather subservient to whatever extrinsic goal we've assigned to it. Second, this subservience transforms the inquiry, usually not for the better, but rather by narrowing the scope of its content, progressively leaving out everything that is not ostensibly expedient for the sake of that extrinsic goal. Third, once this has happened, and the content of the mathema has been significantly diminished and reduced to align as completely as possible with the extrinsic purposes that now govern it, we can hardly see anymore what in this discipline is worth studying and considering for its own sake. And this state of affairs makes it increasingly difficult to perceive why, at any point in time, anyone thought that it was worth knowing X for the sake of knowing X. A striking example of this is what has become, I think, of learning how to write well in the age of generative AI. Now, a human life in which all pursuits of knowledge and all education are subordinated to further extrinsic ends, themselves subordinate to other extrinsic ends, and so on and so forth, is a life that submits itself, and I would dare to say enslaves itself, to a series of demands that come from outside. If you allow me this severe, yet perhaps trivial observation about our contemporary situation, it seems to me that most education nowadays has taken the servile form. Do not worry, I'm confident that St. John's College is a notable exception. I know that. Yet in most higher education contexts nowadays, if you ask a student why they study A, I've experienced that every single time I've taught the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. You ask a student why they study A, they point you to diploma B. And when you ask why they want diploma B, they said it's because they want job C. And when you ask why they want job C, they will say that they want money. And when you ask why they want money, they look like you are completely insane. And then eventually they realize that they want money to buy stuff, to live a comfortable, secure, and above all, pleasant life. Plato and Aristotle helps us see that the life of pleasure cannot, as such, be the happy life. Thus, they're showing us that most human beings live lives that are enslaved to pleasure. And of course, also, perhaps most importantly, enslaved to whoever happened to dictate what types of pleasure we should seek above all. I hardly see any way out of this vicious circle unless we pay attention to the tradition of ancient wisdom that reminds us that some things are worth pursuing for their own sake, and others not. For once we lose track of these human activities that are good in themselves, we risk surrendering our liberty to the chain of things that are merely good for other purposes. So one of the great merits, I think, of the way in which Socrates devises the mathematical curriculum as a prelude to dialectic is that it emphasizes that some human intellectual operations are intrinsically good, that certain types of knowledge should be pursued for their own sake. Retrieving this intrinsic goodness of knowledge is necessary if one wants to secure the liberal character of liberal education against the tendency to surrender education to extrinsic aims and benefits. So in this sense, by studying arithmetic geometry, stereometry, astronomy, and harmonics for the right reasons, namely for the intrinsic value of knowing the truth and cultivating the mind, students of Callipolis would be educated in freedom, liberating themselves from external constraints while they progress toward the good. Just to be clear, I don't mean to say that liberal education stops with harmonics. Dialectic too is certainly liberal and liberating. It is indeed the capstone of liberal education. But it seems to me that if students should eventually be able to grasp something which is entirely and fully good in and of itself, auto kathauto, they should first become familiar with the experience of things worth pursuing for their own sake. And the purification of mathematical studies proposed by Socrates allows just that. While I was emphasizing Socrates' own emphasis on the intrinsic goodness of knowledge in the curriculum of liberal education, you may have reminisced the threefold distinction of goodness in Book 2, when Glaucon and Adeimantus challenged Socrates. Or perhaps you have not reminisced that, but I did. Either justice is good only for the sake of further extrinsic benefits, or it is good only for its own sake, or it is good for its own sake and for further extrinsic benefits. Now you may recall, or not, that while Socrates is tasked to show that justice is good only for its own sake, he explicitly says that he thinks it is good both for its own sake and for the sake of other things. There is a close parallel between that moment in Book 2 and the discussion of the mathematical curriculum in Book 7. It would be crazy to deny the extrinsic usefulness of these mathematical sciences. And that is not what Socrates does. What Socrates does is emphasizing the very easily forgotten intrinsic worth of these types of knowledge while granting their extrinsic benefits. The important thing is to be clear about the ends. The proper function, or ergon, of each of these sciences is to turn the soul toward truth and being. Their extrinsic functions can be acknowledged as long as they are acknowledged precisely as extrinsic functions, as parerga. But the point is that these parerga often threaten the genuine purpose of education, which is to turn the soul around toward what is in the most eminent way. These parerga are good when it comes to becoming a general, but they are of little use if we want to become truly a human being. Entering the third of the tripartite division of the lecture. We are now in a position, play, freedom, and education. So we're now in a position to answer the question of why play would be suited to the liberal education of the guardians. Let's first look at the passage, then I'll offer my reading. That would be T7 on the handout. Well then, the study of calculation and geometry and all the preparatory education, which must be taught before dialectic, must be put before them while they are children, such that the teaching must not be given the shape of a compulsory learning. Why? Because the free persons should not learn any study slavishly. For while indeed labors inflicted upon the body by force do not make the body any worse, no forced study stands steadfast in the soul. True. Then, excellent men, don't use force, but rather bring up the children playing in these studies. In that way, you can better discern what each of them is drawn to by nature. I see here 3 distinct reasons for privileging play, and they're not equally straightforward. All of them rest upon a contrast between play and force, paidia. In and of itself, this contrast is interesting, for usually in Plato's dialogues, the natural opposite to paidia is spoude, as I said earlier, seriousness, not force. But if we accept this paidia-paidia contrast, as assumed by Socrates and Glaucon here, then the first reason consists in saying something like this. I've formalized them on the handout, hoping that it's helpful. So 1, force is a slavish way of treating a person. Guardians are free persons, therefore guardians should not be educated by force. And since the alternative to force is play, guardians should be educated through play. But the second reason is a different argument. Instead of relying on presuppositions about freedom and slavery, it rests on an important distinction between body and soul. Here's a reconstruction. So unlike the body, the soul does not get better by force. The education preparing for dialectic concerns the soul, therefore this education should not be forced. And since the alternative to force is play, guardians should be educated through play. The third reason is quite different. Instead of showing that what would be wrong with educating by force, it suggests a decisively positive contribution of using play. Here I think is the full, although partly implicit argument. Potential rulers must be carefully selected according to their nature. Playful education reveals natural inclinations far more than forced education. Therefore, guardians should be educated through play. In light of these 3 arguments, I see 3 main takeaways that require further exploration on our part. First, there is this mysterious association of play and freedom through the play-force dichotomy. Second, there's the idea that force does not befit free human beings. The idea that force does not befit free human beings is qualified by the idea that force is suited for the body of free persons, but not for their souls. There's another kind of mysterious association, this time an association of play and the soul. Finally, there's this undeveloped idea that play has a revelatory power for educators. Presumably, it reveals natural inclinations of students in an exceptional way. But why? In order to illuminate these points, I think we need to reflect a bit more directly on play. Unfortunately, the Republic gives us very little in terms of play itself. But I think we can draw on some reflections from the laws, as well as from our own human experience of playful activity, and a basic phenomenological description thereof, to begin to see how these things all hang together. Let's first look at one important passage from the laws to serve as a starting point to reflect on play as we experience it. So in Book 2 of the Laws, we come to this passage which has often been read as a definition of play, I think it's misguided to think of it as a definition, but it's very helpful nonetheless. So the Athenian says, then would pleasure not be a correct criterion only for that which is not completed to yield either benefit or likeness, or in turn any harm, but for that thing which came to being only for the sake of what accompanies these, namely the delight, which would be best called pleasure, when none of these follows? You're talking about harmless pleasure only. Yes, and this same thing is what I call play, when it doesn't do any harm or benefit worthy of serious consideration. So for reasons I've argued elsewhere, I think the Athenian stranger is not defining play here, but describing play from the internal perspective of the person who is playing. I see two main points. First, there's the element of pleasure, which can hardly be suppressed from the phenomenon of play. Second, there is the peculiar choice-worthiness of play. When you're genuinely playing a game, you experience pleasure in playing it. If you're not really playing, but merely following the rules of the game. This is to say that pleasure is a constitutive feature of play. Now, if you ask someone why they're playing such or such a game, they would normally either find your question extraordinarily odd or answer as though it was absolutely evident for fun. And that tells us something else. Not only is pleasure a sine qua non condition of play, but the pleasure inherent to playing is the only thing that can be thematically sought for when we are at play. But this is just another way of saying that from the perspective of the player, there are no reasons extrinsic to playing that could answer the why question. We play for the sake of playing, which is the same as saying that we play for the sheer delight of playing. You may object to this account by saying that sometimes you play just to please someone else, maybe your child, friend, or spouse, and not to enjoy playing itself. It's true that we sometimes, or perhaps more than sometimes, do that. I confess I've played many board games to please my wife. But think of what's actually going on when we do that. Either we follow suit without enjoying the game for its own sake and simply have in view extrinsic benefits such as not ruining an evening with friends by being a party pooper. In the best case scenario, other people may still be able to enjoy the games regardless of your unplayful internal disposition. But you're not really playing. In the worst case scenario, you betray too obviously your unplayful disposition, and that ruins the game as a whole. Or we begin to play, at first reluctantly and without genuine enjoyment, and slowly begin to be caught up by the game, played by the game as it were, and start enjoying it for its own sake. And then you're actually playing. So there seems to be an intrinsic choice-worthiness to playful activity that kind of defines it. When you're actively and genuinely playing, you don't have in view any extrinsic purpose. Hans-Georg Gadamer, a 20th century German Platonist, has written beautifully about this phenomenology of play in his major work, Truth and Method. And I really wanted to cite that passage, which is T9 on your handout. I think it's really spot on. Play itself contains its own even sacred seriousness, Gadamer says. Yet in playing, all those purposive relations that determine active and caring existence have not simply disappeared, but are curiously suspended. The player himself knows that play is only play, and that it exists in a world determined by the seriousness of purposes. But he does not know that in such a way he does not know this in such a way that as a player, he actually intends this relation to seriousness. Play fulfills its purpose only if the player loses himself in play. Seriousness is not merely something that calls us away from play. Rather, seriousness in playing is necessary to make the play wholly play. Someone who doesn't take the game seriously is a spoilsport. The mode of being of play does not allow the player to behave toward play as if toward an object. And then he sums it up beautifully with an Aristotelian twist. He says, the being of all play is always self-realization, sheer fulfillment, energeia, which has its telos within itself. So, to go back to our Platonic question, how are these two features, namely the necessary pleasure and intrinsic choice-worthiness of genuine play, helpful in understanding Socrates' proposal about educating future guardians through play? Let's start with freedom versus force. While clearly force puts constraints on freedom, if I'm forced to do something, I'm not freely doing it, how does play rather allow to express freedom? The crucial feature, I think, here is the teleology of play. Recall that Socrates' purification of the pre-dialectic mathematical curriculum aimed at bringing the authentic end of each of the discipline as close as possible to the knowledge enabled by studying it. The idea, I believe, is that seeing the intrinsic worthiness of the knowledge in question will be facilitated if the form of teaching and learning is conducive to retaining the end or purpose within the learning activity itself. If you force geometrical knowledge into the soul of a student against their will and desire, this never happens. The student can hardly perceive that geometry should be studied for the sake of geometrical knowledge itself. Students thusly educated will likely see their efforts as wholly directed toward an external purpose, usually something like satisfying the desire of the persons or the institution from which the learning is forced upon them. If you teach geometry through play, and if the students genuinely play these geometrical games, they're likelier to delight in the sheer learning activity because it is a playful activity. And that helps conceiving of what they acquire as worthy for its own sake. Now to the second point. Why is force suited to improving the body and play suited to improving the soul? Here's a speculative and tentative suggestion. Our body is such that we can conceive of it more or less as an instrument for other purposes. In fact, when we say that we make our body better, what we usually mean is that we're making it better for the sake of something else. Better for running, jumping, swimming, sailing a tall ship, riding a vigorous horse, punching, kicking, mastering a heavy sword, etc. And ultimately, in Callipolis, caring for the body has two purposes, none of which are the body itself: excellence at war and facilitating the health of the soul. In other words, the body is wholly subservient to justice in the city and justice in the soul. While justice and the state of our soul should be conceived of as good for their own sake, the body cannot really, or at least shouldn't. Force may be suited to the body because force and the body are for the sake of something else. Play may be suited to the soul and not to the body because play and the soul are pursued and cared for not for extrinsic purposes, but for their own sake. Finally, why is play especially suited to reveal the natural inclinations of students? I think the pleasurable dimension of play is quite important in that respect. Proposing difficult mathematical studies through play is likely to show a wide range of various propensities toward different topics as a response to these games. Not all students will show the same eagerness to play these difficult games. Naturally, there's also the question of how well will they perform at these games, but I think that what the eagerness to play really shows is just how much each student desires to learn. This inner desire to know that will thereby be on display to the educators is crucial. For the nature of philosophers is chiefly, that's in book 5, the natures of philosophers chiefly characterized by this gigantic appetite, this inexhaustible thirst for knowing. The greater this desire, the likelier the player is to enjoy the game for its own sake and genuinely play with great enthusiasm. They will also show with this enthusiasm that they're naturally inclined to conceive of knowledge, of knowing, as a good pursuit for its own sake. Those who play seriously play for the sake of playing. Those who learn seriously learn for the sake of learning. Those who would be lukewarm and tend to follow the rules without really enjoying, without really playing, would show that they might not be fit for the full training up to dialectical studies. If we take Socrates' thought experiments seriously, we should see that play is an educative tool of tremendous importance for selecting the right natures at each step where the pool of student will be restricted is indispensable to ensure that the proper people are trained in dialectic and eventually becomes the rulers of the city. Lest educators pay the greatest attention to the natural inclination of their students, the power of dialectic could go in the wrong hands. And this to the demise of the beautiful city, as well as to the detriments of philosophy's reputation. One of the precautions Socrates singles out to avoid this, of course, is to avoid teaching dialectic to too young people. So you're not teaching dialectic here, right? Good. Young dialecticians, he argues, are those who always use dialectic for the sake of refutation. Ai eis antilogian chromenoi. They thus abuse arguments as though it were play. Katachrontai, hos paidia. Here, play has a manifestly pejorative meaning, quite different from what I've just been presenting as a promising form of education. And this is a clear case where we must distinguish between good and bad play, or serious and unserious play, teleologically. For although antilogia, refutation or contradiction, most likely has some role to play in dialectic, dialectic is not antilogia. The decisive question is what antilogia is used for. While the mature dialectician uses dialogue to examine the truth, scopein talethes, the young dialectician plays and refutes for the sake of the game. The young dialecticians are playing a bad game because their game has bad rules. And it's got bad rules because it gets the purpose wrong. This is one of the moments in the Republic where we deeply sense that the scope of the argument exceeds by far the very institutions of the city and speech. I think Plato's Socrates is much more worried about the reputation of philosophy and the corruption of philosophy than he is about the selection of bad rulers in a city that never will come to exist. And he treats that question through the question of the selection of good dialecticians for rulership. The last remark I want to make about this selection is that it's not and cannot be a mere question of age. The time taken before exposure to dialectic not only ensures that young, excited, fiery people cool down, it is the time when the educators will progressively select the right natures so as to only initiate to dialectic minds that genuinely care for knowledge and truth. And this, Socrates tells us, will be facilitated by educative games that will reveal the natural inclinations of the players. These games, it goes without saying, will be governed by good rules because everything rulers do when coming back to the cave is done in light of their previous grasp of the good itself. The play of education will be serious play, good play, playing amidst beautiful things, paidein and kalois. I'm coming now to my concluding remarks. If I'm right that Plato explores the educative power of play for liberal education in the city of speech of the Republic, what exactly can we nowadays take away from these reflections for our very, very imperfect actual cities? I'm not exactly an optimistic person, and I don't have a blueprint for the future. But I just want to point to one broad lesson and then briefly gesture at a response to a potential worry. I do think that Plato's Socrates is serious when he claims that knowing math is of great value if one is to be truly a human being. And I think it's important to see that this is the case if and only if the study in question is pursued for its own sake, for the sake of knowing. So at the risk of repeating trivial truths, I think one of the great threats to liberal education nowadays is the contemporary pressure towards productivity. This pressure is everywhere, and its instrumental rationality is so pervasive that it's hard to even imagine a world in which we could be sheltered from its illiberal logic. That does not mean that educators should give up and stop resisting this logic. But I think for the most part, resistance is likelier to happen in the classroom than in anywhere else. The first step of liberation happens whenever a moment of illumination is experienced as the good that it actually is in itself, when the sheer delight of this illumination is enjoyed. While educators have the responsibility to share their enthusiasm for the goodness of learning and the beauty of knowing, students should be encouraged to let themselves get caught up in the playful structure of their learning experience. If you can earn the conviction, the pistis, that knowing is good for your soul regardless of further benefits or other parerga, then this conviction needs to be protected and cultivated in all possible ways. I think such preservation is in itself an act of resistance in our world, perhaps the greatest act of resistance to protect liberal education. You might be worried, different remark, you might be worried that the liberation of learning is sometimes, or even often, experienced not as playful and therefore pleasurable, but rather as toilsome and painful. That's at least how the prisoner's ascent out of the cave is pictured in Republic 7, right before we are told that guardians should not be forced to learn anything in the mathematical curriculum. Is the model of play rosy and naive? Is the cave model too dark? Are they supposed to be compatible pictures? I think this is exactly the kind of interpretive dilemma one constantly faces when reading a Platonic dialogue like the Republic. And it's striking that for our education, Plato has not given us mathematical treatises, but the magnificent gems of his dialogical composition. If we position the mathematical curriculum along the divided line of Book 6, can't believe I'm doing this in one sentence, we are invited to think of the mathematical curriculum, as a dianoetic preparation for eventual noetic insights. But this dianoetic preparation is also the proper locus of all discursive and all dialogical thinking. And so it seems that while a Platonic dialogue cannot present dialectic in the strict sense, but only allude to it in a discursive form, our confrontation with the dialogues, our dialogue with the dialogues, is one way in which we can prepare ourselves to dialectic. But since these dialogues are as playful as philosophic works can be, and since they invite us in turn to engage in them playfully, I think Plato's deeds seems to give, in some sense, the upper hand to the educative model of play. I thank you very much and look forward to our conversation.